Once again, I welcome my listeners to another session of 15 Minutes of Fact, an internet radio program on WGRNradio.com that is devoted to helping people to meet, understand, and support people who are part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's now slightly over 5 months since Occupy Wall Street literally burst on the scene when a group of slightly over 100 protesters decided to stay overnight at Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan. Sure enough, within 2 days, 7 people were arrested and incarcerated, and since that time, this number has reached into the hundreds, mostly people being booked, staying overnight perhaps, and then let go. Now, these were the first people in the movement to experience what will be the subject of the show today, and that is the American prison system, which we will be discussing with our guest in the California Bay Area, Judith Katz. Now, Judith Katz, if you read the slight introduction that came along with the interview on WGRN Radio, you'll see is quite well equipped to have been part of an Occupy movement that was brought to San Quentin State Prison last week when she and some 600 people peacefully assembled in front of the prison's east gate to protest prison conditions. And this was just one rally out of 15 that took place as part of the National Occupy Day in support of prisoners. So welcome to the show today, Judith Katz, and obviously we need to understand a little bit about you before I start asking you what in the world you're up to.
Thank you for having me, Jerry.
Well, I'm happy to have you very much. Tell me, you've been living in the Bay Area for 5.5 years now or so. Have you always been involved in protest work at this point, or did Occupy sort of catch your attention and you joined in? How did you come about to doing this?
Wow, I'm just really enjoying. I heard you say something that I wasn't sure if you said protest or process, and I'm just loving that because to me it's really, this is a process movement more than a protest movement, and it's about changing the way that we relate to each other so that it's, rather than being adversarial and seeing, the other, in this case, the 1% or the people behind bars or, the banker or, the person who's a different color as being different or an enemy, that my hope is that this movement will help us learn how to see each other as part of a dialogue and come to greater unity as a result.
Well, I do agree that the word process has double meaning here because people, if I understand it correctly, are processed into the system. They're processed into a penal operation at a jail system, and that was presumably what you were protesting, but you're saying that this is part of a larger picture?
Mm-hmm.
And what could that be?
Well, I'm just really, what it was is an opportunity for the voices of prisoners to be heard and the voices of the families and the friends of people who are incarcerated, and it's just reached just gargantuan proportions. In the United States, we have the largest number, proportionally, the largest number of people behind bars in the world now for several years now. And I just read the statistic. It's just astonishing. We have 1 out of every 31 people is in the penal system now in our country. And it's just become this huge tragedy in our country. And people needed to be heard about it and seen about it. And so it was just this collaboration between the Occupy movement and the prisoners' rights movement that was really historic. And so, yeah.
Well, when you mentioned the statistics, they are shocking. I think 743 adults incarcerated per 100,000 population. We have about 3 times the number of prisoners in the United States than other countries almost combined. And this all, if I understand Charles correctly, started coming about in the 1980s, where it just took a leap from under 500,000 to now almost 2,300,000. So I also noticed that it came along with an increase, not that San Quentin is an example of this, but an increase in the privatization of prisons. And we all know that if you're running something for a profit, you've got to be able to have product in order to be able to maintain that profit. So paranoid or not, I'd like to know, do you see any correlation between that type of mentality and people going into prisons more, or am I just fantasizing this?
No, I definitely think that you're right. And I've heard a number of instances that really underscore your point, Jerry. I heard recently that the Correctional Corporation of America was bidding on a contract with a government. I think it was a state government, maybe it was Texas, and they required that the capacity of the prison be kept at 90% for them to take the contract. I mean, there's a number of, there was just recently a story about in Pennsylvania that the judge who was sentencing juvenile offenders to a juvenile facility was on the payroll of the facility management that was receiving profits for warehousing young people. Here in California, we had recently, I think it was about 2 years ago, there was a mandate to build more prisons here in California, and in California, close to $50,000 per prisoner to keep people behind bars. And meanwhile, we're only spending, I think it's less than $8,000 per pupil in our public education system. So,
you can't make up numbers like this. You can't make up a scenario that you described without somehow another feeling that you're going crazy. If a corporate entity steps into the prison system and says, I need to have 90% capacity if I'm going to fulfill my contract with you, basically it's a mouth that has to be fed, and that feeding tube happens to belong to the judicial system that we have. Is there something wrong with the way that you see people being processed into prisons, at least in California, to your awareness?
well, I don't know if I would say that it was wrong. I would say that it is a tremendous mishap, a tremendous tragedy, just some really decisions that are being made that are not helping anyone. And it's an illusion that this is keeping us safe, because these people, they go into prison and they aren't being rehabilitated. They're coming out with all kinds of mental problems and emotional problems. And if they're coming out at all, this is creating havoc with our capacity to meet needs in other sectors, because it's sucking so many resources out of our systems.
I have a hard time not comparing that to the creation of wars. If the military-industrial complex, and I just know people are going crazy by listening to me on this, but I'll say it anyway, if the military-industrial complex is to maintain its forces and reward its generals, it has to keep feeding something called a war. And some people don't come back from that war. And when people do come back from that war, they're damaged. Now, we're having a war right now against our own population. We call it incarceration. But I see that no different, especially now that Homeland Security is doing its best to make sure that you and I are protected. I don't doubt that there are going to be increasing numbers of people put into this system. What do you feel about that, and what does Occupy out in California feel about that?
Well, I personally, I'm really past the point of, anger, frustration. I've been working on this issue for over 10 years, and I find myself really dropping into a place of sadness and grief. about it. And that's how I showed up at the Occupy for Prisoners on Monday. On the other hand, I do see, there's a lot of people out there whose, their needs are so they're just, it's just anger. People are enraged about it, and who could blame them because they're feeling so, um, it's really hurting destroying people's lives. This system is ripping families apart and causing a lot of damage to our communities.
Well, there's no doubt that Occupy Wall Street came about to show the inequities in the financial system and the way that initially the breakdown that caused a lot of people to suffer things like foreclosures, loss of homes, loss of jobs, all because of the banksters. But here we're talking about something very personal because people have friends and relatives of their own who sometimes come across or become incarcerated by the prison system. What is your relationship to Occupy for Prisoners, and why do you care what happens to prisoners?
Well, let's see. It's hard to even answer that question. There's such an ocean of grief inside of me about the stories, I actually know people who have been incarcerated, for 30 plus years in solitary confinement. And I'm just thinking about it, really gripped with a powerful sense of tragedy about it.
Now, look, I have to interrupt there. How in the world can anybody in our so-called modern age imagine or allow someone to be placed into solitary confinement for 30 years, much less 30 days? How does this come about, and is there any recourse, so-called legally, to stopping that from happening?
Well, there's definitely recourse in terms of, if you have resources to hire an attorney. If you don't have resources, on the other hand, it's, you're lost in this system, which I would call inhumane. Completely, unfathomably inhumane for me. And actually, you know what, Jerry? I think it's actually closer to 40 years that they've been in prison. It's the longest documented solitary confinement in American history. It's the case of the Angola 3 in Louisiana. And they're in a, small cell the size of a bathroom, and they're, being kept in there on charges which are suspiciously unclear. The evidence was not, it's been a lot of the evidence has been destroyed. I
can imagine the type of evidence that they had 40 years ago to put these people into prison.
Yeah. I really want to focus though on the fact that, there's a lot of people in solitary confinement right now, and it's kind of like a growing industry are these, confinement units, like the one at Corcoran, where a man recently died. I'm concerned about the mental well-being. I think it's torture. It amounts to torture.
If this were happening in any other country, we would have senators standing up pontificating about how wonderful it is to be in a country where that sort of thing doesn't take place, and yet what you're describing to me is no better than a third world banana republic approach to incarcerating people.
Yeah, I'm just...
Well, what sort of people showed up at the Occupy movement? Were they just like you, people that have years of experience in trying to change things, or were they just people who showed up because they became angry?
Well, I actually experienced the group there as being one of the most diverse and beautiful groups. It was a lot of former prisoners, and there's a lot of family members, people who know people on the inside. There was so many young people, in, their brightly colored clothing, and it was just, people from all different kinds of groups from the occupation in Oakland. There were Native Americans there. The three young people who were imprisoned in Iran were there, the hikers.
Well,
So
why? Now that really catches my attention. Why did these three people show up after they experienced prison in Iran?
yeah, I mean, they were there to express I think, to express their solidarity with the people here in the United States who are in prison. I think one of the prisoners spoke, the Iran former prisoner, and she said that, she was in solitary confinement for a couple months, and it really, actually, I think longer than a couple months. I think just after a couple months, she started to really lose it. She was testifying as to her personal experience, in the cell. And so it really changed her life, this experience.
Well, you appear to be a life-changing type person, so tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing. I believe you're associated with the Connection Action Project, something dealing with open myth source. Could you describe a little bit about that and how people might get in touch with you through that?
Yeah. So I'm with the Connection Action Project. We're based in the East Bay. We're very scrappy grassroots initiative. We're oriented towards transformational social change using the power of empathic communication to connect across differences. And we're holding a vision of a world where people are connected at the heart level. And towards that end, we engage in actions that are grounded in a sense of love and affinity for all beings and the planet. So we have a number of different materials about our work on our website, connectionaction.org, and people can reach me that way through that website.
They can reach you at judith@connectionaction.org.
Also, that's my email address.
Yes, and you also are on Twitter as Katz Judith, Katz, or not?
That's me, yeah, Katz Judith, and also we have a Twitter feed for Connection Action at Connection Act.
Connection Act.
Act, A-C-T.
A-C-T, thank you. Well, we're just about at the completion of our 15 minutes of fact. It's amazing how much information we can pack into this little bit of time and how much is left out as well. So I'd like to ask you to, since the subject does at the moment deal with prisoners, leave our listeners with a thought or two about what they can do to get involved in this and to help make a difference.
Yeah, well, they can write a prisoner. I think that, finding a prisoner who you can correspond with is a really wonderful way to help, to make the connection, that personal contact, and really make a difference in someone's life. And I'm imagining you can find prisoners online to write to, and talk to families who have someone in the prison system or in the criminal justice system. Just get to know the real stories of people who are dealing with this unfortunate situation that we're living with in this country, so that we can connect across these, boundaries of right and wrong. Just
people that took a horrible experience and turned it into something good. I don't think that everyone is that well equipped to be able to handle the tribulations that come with being a prisoner. And I want to thank you very much for being here with us to be able to tell us a little bit about your experience, about the need for prison reform, and at very minimum to connect with the prisoner so that we can deal with humanity rather than a statistic. So once again, this is Jerry Ashton, WGRNradio.com, 15 Minutes of Fact, thanking Judith Katz in the Bay Area. and thanking everyone for listening.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.